now turn our attention to Matthew, who is the Japanese painting historian in our band. And I would like to ask Matthew if he would illuminate for us some of the historical context and the art historical precedents for the imagery in the Great Wave. Where did this design come from?
Sure, Joan, thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for that wonderfully illuminating introduction to The Great Wave by Hokusai and its immediate antecedents. I'm going to take us much further back in history, a history of East Asian painting in general, and begin with a few paintings from China. I'm not a historian of Chinese art, but like most of us who study Japanese art at the graduate level, began studying Chinese art already as an undergraduate. And one of the key, I guess there are two main issues or features of Hokusai's Great Wave that I'd like to just touch on right now at the beginning before we go on. And the first of those is the particular form of his wave, those finger-like protrusions or finger-like extensions from the cresting wave itself. The other feature, I'll just reiterate from what Sarah was saying, is the color. And I think we'll see some interesting relationships amongst the works that we'll start to look at now. So the first group that I thought I would touch on is a group of a dozen or so images, all the same size. They appear to be basically the size of an album leaf, but they're mounted on a hand scroll today, kept in the Palace Museum in Beijing. And I imagine most of us have probably not had a chance to view this because it's only on view in Beijing very occasionally. It's so fragile. It's a scroll painted by the great academic painter Ma Yuan of the Southern Song Dynasty. You can see his dates there. I'll just add here that each of these images has a title inscription brushed by Empress Yang Meizi, a very important cultural figure of the Southern Song and the subject of important studies by Huishu Li, among others. She's a professor at the University of California at Los Angeles. The hand scroll consists of 12 sections, and we begin with Light Breeze at Lake Dongting, referencing a very famous place in China. Lake Dongting, of course, is one of the 8 views of Shaoxing. If we can continue to the next slide, perhaps, we'll see another image in which Ma Yuan, in this group of water studies, as it's called today, shows us a very different kind of behavior of the aquatic environment in this range upon range of ripples and waves. You can begin to see some of the pattern-like quality that will eventually find its way into Hokusai's work. Perhaps the next image showing us a view called Clouds Unfurling and Waves Roiling Up, shows us something even closer, perhaps, to Hokusai's image. And so what these, and there are many more, I just have these to show you, but what these begin to show us, I think, is a kind of, it gives us insight into the Southern Song Dynasty's general cultural, if we could say, interest in phenomenology and in natural phenomena and effects in a way that Ma Yuan here creates these images not based on any particular observation, but really as a way to show this bravura brushwork. And the waves really start to become something else. They take on a kind of zoomorphic quality, we might say, that I think really effectively presages what we'll see in Hokusai. Next, please. I have a couple of images more. I just want you to focus here on the single screen painting, this freestanding screen painting on the right of this image by the Southern Song painter Su Han Chen. This is an image in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, called Lady at Her Dressing Table in a Garden. I'm sorry I don't have the MFA credited here, but it is from the MFA. And this is a work that I first became aware of, like the next one we can look at, man sleeping on a bamboo couch from the Yuan to Ming Dynasty. The date's not entirely clear. This work in the Metropolitan Museum also featuring a screen painting. I became aware of this, I became aware of these in the work of Wu Hong, the professor of Chinese art history at the University of Chicago, who wrote a wonderful book called The Double Screen, a book about medium and material in Chinese art. And he focuses on these screen paintings, these images, pictures within a picture, to talk about the subject of water and waves on screen paintings as something that may allude to the psychological state of the sitter. In this case, this man is fast asleep, maybe dreaming of the sea. In the previous image, the woman in front of the mirror, who's looking at herself in the mirror before the screen painting may allude to her own psychological state. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that thesis, but I think it's an interesting and provocative one. But I bring these out also just to show us examples of images on screen paintings of waves already in China. Now, none of these screen paintings themselves survive. We have no extant freestanding or folding screen paintings from China before the Qing dynasty, I think. But we have many examples of them as paintings within paintings, such as the next example. We can look at a painting by Du Jin. Here's the overall image, an image of a gentleman enjoying antiquities. He's appreciating and I guess admiring his collection of bronzes and ceramics and so forth. And behind him, if we can look at the close-up in the next image, is another freestanding screen, in this case of rough waves once again. So this is yet another image that shows us perhaps that this was, we might say, popular subject or common subject of mural images of large-scale pictures in China in the pre-modern period. And then one more image from China, I think, is next. This is a wonderful scroll called The North Sea by the Ming Dynasty painter Zhou Chen, a professional painter, I think active in Suzhou. This work is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And the drama in the picture really begins, I think, at the right, if we have a close-up next, of these rough, almost sort of octopus-like waves with their sort of tentacles that take on a quality that seems to have less to do with water and maybe more to do with some other kind of substance. But again, I think we can see how these are all part of a tradition, the examples of which we first see in the work of Ma Yuan that I showed at the beginning. Our next image takes us into Japan. This is a work that I believe dates from the 17th century, late 17th century, called Rough Waves. It belongs to the Tokyo Fuji Art Museum in the outskirts, the western suburbs of the metropolis. It's an 8-panel folding screen, so it folds, gilded, and on top of which are painted in ink, I think some azurite blue, and a shell-based white pigment, rough waves once again. But here, waves themselves are the subject matter. And I think this may be one of the very earliest examples in Japan of a screen painting that takes waves as the subject. Now, of course, there are other major examples of paintings with great waves in them, such as the famous Matsushima or Pine Island screens by Tawaraya Sotatsu in the Freer Gallery in Washington. And as well as paintings of dragons in which waves prominently appear because dragons are believed to be bringers of rain and emerging from the sea. But this is the earliest example that I'm aware of that takes waves as the sole subject matter. A more dramatic example even than this is our next image. We're quite lucky to have this right here in New York City. It's occasionally on view. Ogata Korin, the great painter of the Genroku period, a 2-panel screen called Rough Waves, in which he also takes waves as his subject matter. And I think as we look at this, we can see that there's some interesting interaction between the larger wave that threatens to fall on the smaller wave beneath, which seems to recoil in almost a kind of animal-like way. You can start to see sort of bird heads and things like that. Part of the power of this image, as I found when I was researching it a number of years ago, is that Korine uses a very particular technique in painting these waves, and that is that he uses a double brush. He takes two brushes and paints so that he creates perfectly parallel strokes in this image, and that adds a certain kinetic quality, a kind of vibrancy, we might say, to these very active waves. He also adds blue, but I think it's interesting to see that the blue outlines, it sort of creates contours or fills in negative space around the waves rather than coloring them in, which I think creates an interesting connection or distinction from Hokusai a bit later. The next work, a pair of folding screens by the great Sakai Hoitsu, the painter who really I think we could credit for having preserved the memory of Korine for posterity. This work was Hoitsu created in reaction to the single two-panel screen by Korine that we just looked at. We know from a letter by Hoitsu that he saw the painting now in the Metropolitan Museum, the two-panel gold screen of waves, and he changed the circumstances of one of his commissions. He was actually commissioned to paint a pair of screens for a client on the subject of birds and flowers, a very common, rather it's a commonplace East Asian picture subject. But because he was so excited by the painting by Korine that he had just seen, he decided to, in a sense, to try to outdo Korine, if that's possible, by instead of gold, using a pair of screens that were sheathed in silver leaf and expanding the visual field from the two-panel screen, single two-panel screen, to a pair of six-panel screens, as we can see. So there's certainly echoes of Korine's work in this painting. There's one more image that I have to show. Here's a detail, I guess, of the right screen of the pair. Thanks, I think we can go on. This would be my last image, which is we could say, a work that functions as part of a big self-advertisement on Hoitsu's part. He publishes a manual, kind of picture book of images that he thinks are probably the ones that should be most closely associated with him as an artist in 1817. This book is called Oson Gafu, or the painting picture manual of Oson. Oson is a name that Hoitsu used. And he hires Kamo Suetaka, who's a great literary figure of the time, a great intellectual, to sort of crown it with a preface, a very intellectual preface at the beginning. And he has it published by an Edo publisher named Izumiya Shojiro. And one of the, it's not a very big book, but one of the images that he includes is an image of a single cresting wave. As you can see here, printed in a way that seems to suggest his use of a double brush as well, a kind of homage to Korine. And also printed in a way also that does not include any color. This is only, the colors included are basically just shades of gray. I find this interesting because it's dated to 1817. The form of the wave, this is a book that circulated in Edo. We know that Hoitsu and Hokusai lived fairly close to one another. I have not seen any evidence that they actually knew each other or interacted. They were members of different social status groups, and so I imagine that Hoitsu probably was not interested in interacting with someone as a lowly craftsman like Hokusai, I guess. But they were almost exactly the same age. I think Hoitsu is a year younger than Hokusai. I find this an interesting image to contemplate in the context of Hokusai's Great Wave, and maybe to see it as one of the images perhaps that Hokusai may himself have seen. Again, color is absent from this image. Hokusai finishes it off by using the Prussian blue, as Sarah so beautifully stated earlier. Thank you very much. That's I think those are all the images I have.
Thank you, Matthew. That was illuminating and exciting. And I think we have lots of food for thought and further research. Certainly, the Olson Gafu had a profound impact on many Surimono artists in the Hokusai group. And we have many examples of, I wouldn't say plagiarism, but points of inspiration taken from the seminal book. But it was great to see some of these Chinese prototypes that I'm totally unaware of wave screens in the background. It was very, very fascinating. Thank you. That's terrific. Christine, I hope you're still with us. We haven't lost you.
I'm here.
Great. Let's turn our attention to the environment in which this iconic image was made. The Great Wave emerged from such a rich artistic background, and its composition had immediate impact, not only in Japan, but on artists abroad. A remarkably robust influence that continues to this day. And as the author of Hokusai's Great Wave biography of a global icon, can you tell us a few of the highlights from your fascinating research? In particular, we would all love to hear your viewpoint as to what is it that makes this image so iconic and accessible to cultures across the globe through the centuries.
Well, thank you, Joan. It's really hard to encapsulate the many reasons for this image's iconicity, precisely because there are so many. But let me single out perhaps three that I think stand out, to me at least. And I think I should also point out to start with that the reception of this image is very much dependent on who you are, where you are, and when you lived, because the reception of the image has changed dramatically over time. But I think that it's fair to say that one reason for its iconicity is the composition's sheer visual power. Although Under the Wave of Kanagawa, to give it its proper title, was conceived as part of a series celebrating Mount Fuji, it is in fact the towering wave in the foreground that first grabs your attention. And it grabs your attention and holds it. But more than that, and punning aside, I think this image is incredibly immersive. It makes you feel as if you are actually in the water. So it creates a kind of intimacy that is rather extraordinary. While the wave speaks to the awesome forces of nature, the boats cutting through the wave add a kind of human dimension to the drama. And this combination of elements, both nature and human, I think gives the print kind of universal resonance. And what I mean by that is that the print's appreciation doesn't really require any specialized knowledge. You don't have to know anything about Japan to appreciate this. A second factor that's contributed to this print's iconicity is the medium itself. And I think that has to be really emphasized. There are many works of art that we talk about as being iconic today, but most of them are unique works of art, like the Mona Lisa. This is not a unique painting. This is a woodblock printed multiple, one that had very wide circulation during Hokusai's lifetime. As Sarah Thompson mentioned earlier, they're thought to have been somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 impressions of it. And there are as many as 200 surviving in collections around the world, but particularly in the United States and Europe today. And the multiplicity of the print is a major factor in its gaining celebrity, because it was circulating very widely within Japan during Hokusai's lifetime and also later. But I think related to multiplicity is the many variations of the print that began with Hokusai's own. In addition to the print with its distinctive blue coloring, Hokusai created another wave in his 100 views of Mount Fuji. And although it doesn't have the striking palette, it is nonetheless a very, very dramatic image, and one that's much closer to the other versions that Matthew was showing us a little bit a moment ago, with a kind of claw-like extensions. But what's distinctive about this version in the book is that Hokusai reverses the direction to reflect the right to left reading of a Japanese book. In addition to Hokusai, there were many artists of his generation and later who picked up this subject. And the fact that an artist such as Hiroshige picked it up is one indication that this was already a very popular image in the 19th century in Japan. I think that this image, probably more than the more famous horizontal view of the Great Wave by Hokusai that we're focusing on today, I think that this image was probably much more influential in Europe because it was issued in 1858 after Japan was opened up, and it was circulating in far greater numbers in Europe than than Hokusai's. And if you trace the many adaptations of the Great Wave in Europe, including this plate that was issued by Royal Copenhagen in 1885, I think you can see more clearly the influence of this later print rather than Hokusai's. But all of this speaks to the multiplicity and the circulation of these images and the influence of that very process. The last point I want to raise is the sheer communicative power of Hokusai's wave as a graphic design. It can be reduced to its absolutely barest contours and you still recognize it. And this is a perfect example. Here, the creamy filling of an Oreo cookie has been shaped, and no one would mistake it. Everybody immediately would recognize it.
Fantastic.
Very much a brand-like, a logo-like quality that makes it very easily adapted to all kinds of purposes. And some of which I will show you a little bit later on. But to reiterate, I think as a graphic design, as a very simple graphic design with enormous power, this image has almost no match.
Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful. And I think as we, the audience, are enjoying this travelogue, if you will, through the history of Japanese painting and prints, as we get to this Oreo cookie, yes, indeed, it still has an incredible impact. It's quite different than the Hoitsu screens that we saw before or the Korean, and you have identified that for us perfectly.